Hi everyone, welcome to English Rise. This is a channel for those who want to improve their English but also want to develop focus, discipline, and mental clarity. Here, English is not treated as a subject, but as a practice that trains not only your language skills, but the way your mind works. If you are new here, consider subscribing and staying with the channel. These videos are created to help you train your listening and reading in English while reflecting on psychology, self-mastery, and personal growth. Now let's begin. Part 1. The invisible habit that slows you down. Most people believe their problem with English is lack of vocabulary, or grammar, or confidence. But the real habit slowing you down is quieter than that. You translate. You translate without noticing, without choosing to, without questioning it. English enters your ears, travels to your native language, and only then makes sense. This process feels natural because you've been doing it for years. But natural does not mean efficient. Translation creates distance. Distance between hearing and understanding, between thinking and responding, between intention and speech. And that distance is where hesitation is born. Part 2. Why translation feels safe. Translation feels comfortable because it keeps you in control. When you translate, you stay anchored in your native language. You don't fully step into English. You observe it from a familiar place. This feels safe. Your native language is automatic, effortless, emotionally neutral. English, on the other hand, demands attention. So your mind uses translation as a protective mechanism. You tell yourself you are processing, but what you are really doing is delaying exposure. Part 3. The cost of translating everything. Every time you translate, you slow the process down. Conversation does not wait for internal conversions. Real English happens in real time, and translation cannot keep up with reality. This is why you understand English but struggle to respond quickly. Your mind is busy converting meaning instead of creating it. Over time, translation becomes a bottleneck. You know what you want to say, you feel it clearly. But by the time your sentence is ready, the moment has passed. Part 4. Why thinking in English feels impossible at first. Thinking in English feels unnatural because it removes your main support, your native language. When you stop translating, there is a brief mental silence, a gap, and that gap feels uncomfortable. Your mind asks, what do I do now? How do I know if this is correct? What if I think the wrong thing? This silence is not emptiness, it is transition. But most people panic in this space and return immediately to translation. Not because they must, but because they are not used to staying there. Part 5. The role of simplicity in thinking in English. Thinking in English does not start with complex ideas. It starts with simple ones. When you translate, you try to preserve complexity. You want your English thoughts to match the depth of your native language. But that expectation blocks progress. Thinking in English begins when you accept simpler structures, shorter thoughts, clearer intentions, less precision. This simplicity is not regression. It is foundation. And this foundation must be built patiently. Part 6. Why your mind resists this change. Your mind resists thinking in English because it feels inefficient at first. Translation feels faster because it is familiar. Thinking directly in English feels slow and unstable. Your brain prefers what it already knows, so it pulls you back to the old system. This resistance is not a sign that thinking in English is wrong. It is a sign that your brain is adapting. And adaptation always feels uncomfortable before it feels natural. This is only the beginning. Because training your mind to think in English requires a deeper shift, not only in language, but in attention, patience, and control. Part 7. The moment you stop trusting translation. At some point, translation stops feeling helpful. Not suddenly. Gradually, you begin to notice the delay. Someone speaks. You understand, but your response arrives late, and that delay creates tension. You feel mentally present, but verbally behind. This is when translation reveals its limitation. It cannot support real interaction. Translation was useful at the beginning. It helped you survive exposure. It gave you a sense of control. But survival is not fluency, and control is not flow. To move forward, something must be released. Part 8. The fear behind thinking directly in English. Thinking in English removes a layer of protection. When you translate, you can edit before you exist in the language. When you think directly in English, thoughts arise raw, unfiltered, incomplete. This feels risky, because now mistakes happen inside the thought itself, not only in speech. You fear thinking incorrectly, as if thoughts could be wrong. But thoughts are not evaluated. They are experienced. The fear is not intellectual. It is emotional. You are afraid of losing control inside the language. Part 9. Why thinking in English requires patience. Thinking in English is slower at first, not because your mind is weak, but because new neural paths are forming. Your brain is building shortcuts where none existed before. And shortcuts take repetition. If you rush this phase, you return to translation. If you tolerate it, something important changes. English stops being something you pass through. It becomes a place you stay in. Part 10. The role of attention in language thinking. Translation divides attention. You listen in English but process elsewhere. Thinking in English demands full presence. You must stay with the sound, with the structure, with the intention. This is why thinking in English feels mentally demanding. It asks you to be here, not half here, not mentally switching, fully present. And presence is exhausting when you are not used to it. Part 11. Why emotions are the turning point. You don't truly think in a language until you feel in it. Emotions bypass translation. When you are surprised, you don't translate surprise. You react. This is why emotional moments often trigger spontaneous English. You laugh. You react. You respond. Emotion collapses distance. And distance is what translation needs to survive. Part 12. Letting thoughts be imperfect. Thinking in English means accepting rough thoughts, incomplete sentences, simple words, imprecise structures. This imperfection is not failure. It is movement. You don't think fluently before you think poorly. You think poorly until fluency stabilizes. Most people never reach this stage because they demand elegance too early. Elegance comes later. First comes permission. Part 13. When English becomes internal. There is a moment, quiet and subtle, when English stops feeling external. You don't notice it immediately, but you begin to catch yourself thinking small things in English. Labels, reactions, simple observations. These moments are fragile. If you judge them, they disappear. If you allow them, they multiply. This is how thinking in English grows. Not through force, through allowance. We are approaching the most important shift, the moment when translation is no longer needed, and English becomes direct. Part 14. The subtle shift from translation to direct response. At first, you don't notice the change. There is no dramatic moment where translation suddenly stops. It fades. You begin to respond before your native language appears. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough to feel different. This is unsettling, Because translation gave you certainty. Direct response gives you speed, but less control. You start answering with simpler structures, shorter sentences, clear intentions, and something unexpected happens. Communication improves, not because your English became advanced, but because it became immediate. Part 15. Why speed matters more than complexity. Fluency is not elegance. It is continuity. A simple sentence delivered on time is more powerful than a perfect sentence delivered late. Translation trains you to optimize correctness. Thinking in English trains you to optimize flow. Flow keeps conversations alive. Flow creates connection, and connection matters more than precision. Once you experience this, returning to translation feels restrictive. Part 16. The temporary loss of intelligence you must accept. There's a psychological cost to thinking in English. You will feel less intelligent, not because you are, but because your expressive range is smaller. This feeling is uncomfortable. Your ego resists it. You are used to sounding sharp, articulate, controlled. In English, at first you sound simpler. This simplicity feels like loss, but it is investment. Every fluent speaker paid this price. Those who refuse to pay it remain stuck translating forever. Part 17. Why translation keeps your mind busy but not effective. Translation creates activity, not effectiveness. Your mind is constantly working, converting, checking, adjusting. This creates mental fatigue. Not because English is hard, but because you are doing double work. Thinking in English reduces effort. Once the habit forms, mental energy frees up. This is when English stops feeling exhausting. Part 18. Building trust with your English thoughts. Trust is essential. You must trust that your first thought is good enough to exist. Not perfect. Enough. Every time you allow a thought to stay in English without translating it, you reinforce this trust. Trust grows quietly, through repetition. And once trust stabilizes, translation becomes unnecessary. Part 19. When thinking in English becomes your default. Eventually, something changes. You stop deciding to think in English. It happens. Your mind selects English based on context, not effort. This is the goal, not constant English, but natural English. You still have your native language, but you are no longer dependent on it to survive in English. This stage feels calm, grounded, unforced. We are now close to the final understanding. The reason thinking in English was never about language alone. Part 20. Why thinking in English is really about identity. At the deepest level, thinking in English is not a linguistic shift. It is an identity shift. When you translate, you remain anchored in who you already are. Your native language holds your history, your personality, your sense of competence. Thinking directly in English asks you to temporarily step outside that identity, to allow yourself to exist in a less defined version of who you are. This feels destabilizing, because identity provides certainty, and uncertainty is uncomfortable. So translation becomes a way to protect the self you recognize. Part 21. The fear of losing your inner voice. Many people don't realize this, but they fear something specific. They fear losing their inner voice. The voice that thinks clearly, that reasons deeply, that feels intelligent. When you think in English, that voice sounds different, simpler, less nuanced. And the mind interprets this as loss, as if thinking in English erases depth. But depth is not erased. It is postponed. Depth returns after the language stabilizes. But first, you must survive the phase of simplicity. Part 22. Why most people never cross this threshold. Most learners stay at the edge. They translate enough to function. enough to understand, enough to survive. But they never fully commit to thinking in English, because commitment requires tolerance. Tolerance for feeling incomplete, tolerance for sounding basic, tolerance for uncertainty. And modern learning culture rarely teaches tolerance. It teaches optimization. But optimization too early kills adaptation. Part 23. The role of daily internal practice. Thinking in English does not begin in conversation. It begins alone, in observation, in labeling, in quiet commentary. You describe what you see, what you feel, what you are about to do, not out loud, internally. These moments seem insignificant. They are not. They are the foundation of automatic thinking. The mind learns through use, not through intention. Part 24. Why consistency matters more than intensity. You don't need hours. You need continuity. Thinking in English for short moments, every day, teaches the brain something important. That English is not an event. It is a state. Intensity creates pressure. Consistency creates familiarity. And familiarity removes fear. Part 25. When thinking stops feeling like practice. Eventually, thinking in English stops feeling like training. You no longer remind yourself. You notice it happening. A thought appears in English without effort, and you don't interrupt it. This is the moment translation loses its function. Not because you rejected it, but because you outgrew it. Part 26. The quiet confidence that follows. There is a calm confidence that emerges from this shift. Not the confidence of perfection, but the confidence of familiarity. You are no longer fighting the language. You are moving with it. English becomes a tool, not a test. And when English stops being a test, expression becomes possible. We are now ready to close this reflection properly, but not yet. Because before ending, there is one final understanding that must settle. Part 27. The final shift. From control to trust. At some point, the effort to control every thought becomes heavier than the fear of letting go. You realize something quietly. You don't need to monitor English constantly. You don't need to supervise every sentence. You don't need to translate to be safe. You begin to trust the language, not blindly, but patiently. You allow thoughts to exist without immediately questioning them. You stop interrupting yourself. And in that space, English settles. This trust is not built through confidence. It is built through familiarity, through time spent inside the language without escaping it. Part 28. Why translation was never the enemy. Translation was not a mistake. It was a stage. It helped you understand. It helped you survive early exposure. It gave you structure when English was unfamiliar. But every structure must eventually be removed for movement to continue. Holding on to translation for too long turns support into limitation. The goal was never to eliminate translation aggressively. The goal was to grow beyond the need for it. Part 29. When English becomes a place, not a task. There is a subtle moment when English stops feeling like something you do. It becomes a place your mind can stay in. You listen and remain in English. You think and remain in English. You respond without leaving. This stability changes everything. Speaking becomes easier because thinking is already there. Listening becomes clearer because attention is not divided. English stops being effortful and starts being present. Part 30. The real outcome of thinking in English. Thinking in English does not make you perfect. It makes you available. Available to respond. Available to participate. Available to exist in the language without hiding behind preparation. You stop asking, "Is this correct?" and start asking, "Does this communicate?" That shift is fluency, Not mastery of rules, but comfort in use. Part 31. What this process teaches you about yourself. This journey was never only about English. It taught you patience, tolerance for imperfection, the ability to stay present in discomfort. These skills extend beyond language. They shape how you face challenges, how you learn, how you grow. English becomes a training ground, not only for communication, but for self-mastery. Training your mind to think in English is not about forcing thoughts. It is about allowing them. Allowing simplicity before complexity. Allowing imperfection before fluency. Allowing presence instead of control. Here at English Rise, this is exactly what we do. We use English as a tool to train your listening, your thinking, and your ability to stay present and disciplined. If you stayed until the end, thank you for your time and attention. That alone shows commitment. And if this type of calm, deep, and reflective English practice helps you grow, both in the language and in yourself, consider subscribing to the channel and continuing this journey with us. Not to rush, but to rise. See you in the next story.